So start with a little bit about myself. I'm Scott Burson. I'm a regional planner here at the Coastal Regional Commission of Georgia. We're based in Darien, Georgia, just between Brunswick and Savannah. I have a Master of Community Planning from Auburn University, and before that, I studied communication and journalism at Columbus State in Columbus, Georgia, which is a great city if you have not been there. I always love to talk up Columbus. So when we talk about complete streets, one of the things that I always kind of hear from people, or I get the impression from people, is that when we talk about complete streets and walkability and bikeability and livable communities and things like that, what we tend to think of is that this is a luxury, kind of an amenity that's mostly for young people, for kind of yuppie millennials with scarves and coffee and flannel shirts, biking down by the waterway. It's all kind of about millennials and kind of Gen Xers and kind of these kind of yuppie folks who are, trendy, but maybe it's a luxury thing that we can have that would be nice, but it's not, critically important in the way that some of our other things are. But the thing is, that's absolutely not true at all. Walkability is, if anything, and livability and complete streets, if anything, it's more important for two groups than for anybody else, and that's children and our older adults and our older citizens. Both of these groups need walkability and need a way to get around safely in ways that, it's more than what the millennials and the kind of the prime working age people need. And they're unfortunately the two subgroups that are perhaps most overlooked in planning in general. And so what we want to talk about here is why, when we talk about planning in complete streets and walkability, why children in particular in this case are most important, are really important to look at when we make these kinds of design decisions in the future for our cities. So I want to start with a quote that I think kind of gets us started here, which is that kids rely on streets to get to school, to meet friends, to run errands with their parents, to play, and to explore their surroundings. But most streets were not built with children in mind. They were designed pretty much exclusively in a lot of this country around automobiles, with big, wide traffic lanes and no real room for human life. Parents and caregivers teach kids that streets are dangerous places to be avoided and to navigate them only with an adult. And that's from Jeanette C. Kahn, the permanent chair of the Global Designing Cities Initiative and a former commissioner at the New York City DOT. And I think this is a really good quote that kind of gets to the heart of the matter, is that, we navigate cities by streets, either in cars or on foot. And kids don't drive, right? So their only way to navigate our cities and our neighborhoods is on foot or perhaps by bike. But we teach them, now that they shouldn't do that ever without the caregiving and the supervision of an adult, which is not ideal for a lot of reasons, and not what a lot of people grew up with if they think back to how they were as kids. So I wanted to throw this in here because I saw this tweet go massively viral a few weeks ago. And I thought it would be interesting to include because while, this is not what a lot of, single family neighborhoods where kids are growing up look like, it does speak to a kind of overall sense of deprivation that I think a lot of people feel. And I think a lot of people will look at this image and feel some sort of some sort of empathy for it. Especially as you've gotten older and you start to think, where, if I had a kid, where would I send them to play? Where would I feel they could navigate safely? And things like this are increasingly the way that we build our communities, even now, even with this kind of new, knowledge and ideas of building walkable communities. We still see things like this. We still see, kids walking to school or, walking through their neighborhoods in areas that are clearly not designed for them and are clearly not designed with them in mind. And you might even be more familiar with a much more simpler visualization, just like this. I mean, this might be something that you experienced in your own school, in your own childhood, is seeing just walking through a neighborhood that has no infrastructure for you. And while this may not look, too bad, it does still kind of have this idea of a space that is treating kids, is treating people who don't drive as an afterthought. There's no crossings, there's no, it's unpleasant, and you're definitely not seen as welcome. And so why is this a problem? This is a really big problem, and it's getting worse. So if we look at the statistics, 71% of older adults walked or rode their bikes to school as a kid. That's dropped an enormous number. Now only 17% of kids do. And they spend about 30% less time playing outside. And sometimes they play as little as 5 or 10 minutes a day of unstructured time. They may go to baseball practice or soccer practice or something like that. But it's not the same. It's still supervised. It's still heavily regimented. And it is increasingly acknowledged by the medical profession that unstructured play, exploration, this idea that you can be independent and doing things with your own brain as a child is extremely important, way more important than structured sports or structured supervision. And as we build this way, we continue to widen roads, which makes it even more dangerous. It's kind of a vicious cycle, is making it more and more dangerous to walk or bike around neighborhoods for kids. And then as we close schools to save money and build large consolidated schools way on the outside of the city, which is very common, we are increasingly forcing kids to drive or to ride the bus long distances, as far as 40 minutes or an hour each way to the new consolidated super school, way outside the city, way outside on the edge of the city with a giant parking lot, making it all but impossible for anybody to walk to school or bike to school, even if they wanted to. And so this is just an example of the kinds of things I'm talking about. This is in Metro Atlanta. So this is just a Google Maps shot of a neighborhood kind of in Metro Atlanta. This is a hypothetical. I don't know, if this is true. I just picked a house at random, but imagine, if you will, that there was a family with 2 kids who lived in the house circled in red, in the center of the top center of the image. And they went to that elementary school circled in yellow. There is no way for them to walk to that school, which is, not even half a city block away. It's a couple hundred feet, if that. The only option that they could do to walk there, to drive there, is to follow that pink line all the way down off the map, out onto that arterial road, all the way back up, and all the way up that winding hill to get to their school. They cannot cross that woods. It's built up by a retaining wall. There's absolutely no connection between that neighborhood and that school. And so these kids, yes, they have a yard they can kind of jump around in. But if they wanted to walk to school with friends, there's no way for them to do that. There's no way for them to get to a shop or a park or anything like that. They will have to be driven by their parents every single time they want to do anything, all the way up until they get their own cars, 10, 12, 13 years later. And this is increasingly becoming a built form that we see. This is a relatively wealthy neighborhood, but we see this kind of form all over the place. So this is bad news for a couple of reasons. One, every single one of these roads has to absorb all of this traffic. So, there's no way, if there's no connectivity and there's no way for kids to get around on their own, every single trip for those kids has to be done through a parent chauffeur. Every play date, every school day, every sports event, every, doctor's appointment, everything has to be done in a car with parents. Now multiply that by, all the kids in the city over and over again, and then multiply that again by, a built environment that places houses away from connected streets so that one collector road has to absorb all of those car trips. That makes the streets unsafe. That makes the streets congested, and it makes it unsafe for everybody, even for the kids in cars, let alone kids who are trying to navigate that space on foot. And it's bad news for the kids. I mean, this kind of environment fosters a lack of agency and independence. So kids do not have the ability to function on their own until they get a car as teenagers. They can't walk around. They can't go to the corner store and buy a bar of candy. They can't go down to the park and pick up, soccer. There's no agency. Every single thing they do has to be by requesting it from an adult to time them and take them somewhere else. And this kind of environment makes it less interesting just to exist. There's very few interesting places to play or to exercise, and especially as you get into the tween and teen years where you're seen as a nuisance by a lot of people. You're not cute anymore. You can't go down to, the neighborhood playground, even if you do have one. You don't have money to go, to drive down somewhere or anything like that. And then so what you get is a reversion to, exclusively solo play, a lot of screen time. A lot of what we saw during the pandemic was, kids just getting absorbed into stuff like Fortnite and video games. And why wouldn't they? What other option would they have? And here's another thing this is an article that I saw floating around quite a lot over the last couple of weeks. And it just kind of speaks to that. This is from City Lab. It says, why aren't teenagers especially, where are they not seen as invaders? They're big, they're loud, they're too old for playgrounds. They're too young and loud and broke for restaurants and stores. And the thing is, even when we do provide parks and things like that, one, it's difficult to get to them, and two, they're often, single-use sports parks and things like that that are designed for a very specific type of user. And so, what does it mean to actually have a street for kids and a street and a transportation network for kids? It's really built into two platforms that kind of support everything. One is improved and independent mobility. So this is making sure that kids and caregivers, especially as well, including people pushing strollers, mothers and people and families have efficient and sustainable choices to move around their cities reliably and predictably. So that's meaning that if there is a bus and it comes once every 2 hours, that's not acceptable, right? That's not efficient or predictable a lot of the time. And that kids and young adults can benefit from that mobility with autonomy. They can move around by themselves. They can walk, cycle, transit, and they can feel safe doing so. That's a street for kids. That's all it means at its heart. An extra thing is that there are spaces to pause. So it is a place where there is interest and there are kind of things to do and look at. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's some sort of, fun playground every couple feet or anything like that. It just means that there's something that breaks up the space, that it's not just purely a sidewalk on the ground that kids walk through for 2 miles. And we can go into a little bit more detail about this. We'll go through these pretty quick, but just generally, what does the ideal kid-friendly street look like? Well, first of all, it's got wide sidewalks, so kids and caregivers can walk safely without getting threatened by traffic, can push strollers, bigger families can walk safely and still feel like they are protected from traffic and on somewhere that's dedicated to them. The street has residencies and stores nearby so that there are eyes on the street. We actually, we don't want these paths to be isolated. That's the last thing we want. We want to be able to have people, Jane Jacobs style, looking down on the street, seeing kids, watching them, seeing what's going on, making sure that there's no, sketchy people around, if somebody's getting hurt, if somebody's getting bullied, just to keep them safe and just in a very natural way. It can just be front porches, it can just making sure that there are, there is activity on the street so that, it feels like an actual place and feels like kids can get around. Bike infrastructure and safe, intentional intersection crossings. So kids and older folks, intersections are really, really a rough go for a lot of people. They can be confusing depending on the design, especially with bike infrastructure. It can be kind of a challenge to get across some of these larger streets. And the bike for kids, is one of the main ways that they can get around get around efficiently without any kind of adult intervention. And so building safe bike infrastructure, and especially safe crossings, is really, really important. Lower speed limits, and this means lowering speed limits by design, not just through enforcement. We can lower speed limits all we want. We can lower them by 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour. We can say, slow school zone all we want, but if we design the road like a highway, people are going to drive it like it's a highway. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we put the speed limit. So we need to make sure that we have interventions that are designed that make the street a complete street and a kid-friendly street. You can see on this image, it could just be speed bumps. It can be adding some curves just to make people slow down a little bit, and adding just a little bit of more intentionality to the way we design the street. And this is all I mean by having small spaces to stop, hang out, explore, anything like that. It can be as simple as just having a little wall where people can sit down and chat and eat a snack or something. We just want to make sure that it's not a long blank sidewalk, because that's going to bore the kids to death and make them not want to go out, and also probably feel a little bit unsafe. And then to ensure that those streets have critical connections, they serve places where kids are actually going to go: parks, schools, little shops if they can, ice cream store, anything that kids will actually use. So that's the ideal street just in general. So what does it actually look like in person? What can we do? Oh, we actually have a whole framework for this that's already built up. It's called Complete Streets. And this is something that some of you on the call, may already be familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, Complete Streets is a very well-worn, time-tested policy package that has been tested all throughout the country, and it's got support from all kinds of agencies and groups: GDOT in Georgia, the U.S. Department of Transportation, AARP, all kinds of places. This is kind of the gold standard for easy, prescriptive ways to make our streets better for everybody, and in this case, particularly for kids. And the way this is it just makes sure that our streets are enabling safe use for all ages and abilities. So what are included in Complete Streets? So for this part, we're just going to go through these six items, and we're going to go through what it actually means, because Complete Streets is a design-focused process. So it's what kind of actual design steps can we take to the street to make it safer, and to make it not just safer, but more efficient, more pleasant, more usable for more people, rather than just moving cars through as quickly as possible. And the first thing is, well, actually, let's start here. So this is just generally what a Complete Streets revision might look like in the average kind of small town city. And one of the most important things is to note that there's been no change in the right-of-way. So you can see on the left image here, it's still the same road. It's a 70-foot right-of-way. It's sparse traffic, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5-ish lanes with some parking. And it doesn't look that great. And because there is such a wide strip of pavement, people are going to be going pretty darn fast on this road. I could guarantee it. And all we did as a Complete Streets treatment for this road is add some new striping, add bike lanes. We took away one lane and just kind of added a nice big median and planted some trees. But we didn't have to repave it. There was no repavement. There was no, eminent domain acquisition or anything like that. And you can see, at this image, it sure doesn't look like there's suddenly a whole lot of congestion here. So this is just one example of kind of what a Complete Streets revamp would look like at the end. So let's talk about sidewalks. So sidewalks are really, really important. And that's, you know, that seems like common sense, but think about it. Sidewalks are the area where people are interfacing with each other and with businesses. Even if you drive somewhere in the downtown or something, you have to get out of your car and you have to get on the sidewalk, unless you are, you know, going through a drive-through. The sidewalk is the place where you're interfacing with the rest of the city, with people, with storefronts, with everything. And apart from that, the sidewalk is the most equitable infrastructure, transportation infrastructure thing we can build, right? It serves everybody. It serves people with disabilities who can use wheelchairs or whatever they need to get around. It serves rich people. It serves poor people. It serves everybody. It serves animals. It is the most equitable transportation network that we have. And if we build them out and we connect them and make it a real connected infrastructure system, we're solving a whole lot of problems at once, including promoting healthy lifestyles and encouraging people to get exercise just as a byproduct of getting around. And so how do we design a sidewalk more than just putting some concrete on the ground? So generally, we want a 5-foot minimum walking space, but usually we want quite a bit more. And the way that we think about a sidewalk is we think about it in terms of zones. And this can all be kind of changed depending on your local context. This is what I mean by zones. So you can take a look at this and you can see usually 3 distinct zones in a complete streets focused sidewalk. Your first zone is kind of this frontage zone where you're putting, you know, signs and placards and tables and things that are very specific to the buildings on that side of the street. And you've got your travel lane kind of in yellow that's just for people to walk up and down. And then you've got a street furniture zone, which includes your benches, trash cans, fire hydrants, trees, bike corrals, whatever you need. And that's really important to distinguish, because a lot of times what you'll see with sidewalks, if you go walking around, you know, some older cities and older towns in this area, is street lamps and trash cans and trees and stuff just kind of haphazardly all over the place, or signs just kind of all over the place, and people having to navigate kind of around them, especially people with kids or with dogs or pets or on, you know, in wheelchairs or things like that. And that's something we definitely need to avoid and make it as easy and pleasant as possible to walk. But it is not just urban areas. You can see the exact same concept play out here in a residential area. This is the same complete streets treatment, just in a residential area, but you can see the exact same type of zoning treatment here. You have a frontage area that focuses on the houses and the foliage and the walk up and all that. You have a travel area, and then you have a street furniture area, which in this case is just plantings and streetlights, which is fine. Perfectly acceptable for a predominantly residential area, but it's the same concept. That brings us to crossings. So crossings are the major barrier for complete streets treatment. This is where people will stop and turn around if they are trying to get somewhere. And they're especially critical for people who are very young, and who are older, because the very young kind of get confused. They kind of wander around. They're not sure where to go. You know, they're more likely to, you know, walk halfway down, then turn around and walk back and look at something on the ground. And then the older folks take a lot more time on average to cross than the walk signals are often designed. A lot of the walk signals are designed for a, you know, 25-year-old white male walking pace, which cuts it pretty close for a lot of people. So crosswalks in general should be designed for a safe, seamless transition, and then they should be placed frequently. And this is really important because a lot of fatalities happen. You know, we actually just got numbers today that 78% of the fatalities in Georgia were not at an intersection. And part of the reason for that is that the intersections where there are crosswalks are so far away from where people oftentimes need to go. So a lot of times there will be a crosswalk in an intersection a mile down the street from your apartment, but you need to get across the street right now to go to the grocery store. So you just dart across the street because that's what makes logical sense. And then people get hit because of that. And that's something that we, you know, see over and over and over again when we look at these pedestrian death reports and injury reports. So frequent placement and making sure that they are connected where people need to be and want to be. And so one of the things for designing crosswalks is we need to make sure that they are raised up to the level of the sidewalk rather than down, ramped down to the street. Because when we raise the crosswalk up to the level of the sidewalk, what we're doing is we're saying that the pedestrian is given priority, right? The driver has to slow down almost like a big speed table. But it's a little bit more costly, and so we don't see it very often. But what the result is that a lot of times drivers will just blaze right through them. And doing this, raising it up to the grade of the sidewalk, makes it a lot safer and makes it a lot more pleasant for the pedestrian to cross. Managing sight lines at crossing is really, really important, something a lot of people overlook. You can tell, in this case, all this means is making sure that when you are letting people cross the street, that we are putting them in the line of vision of drivers. So imagine on this picture, if that little bulge out was not there, but that street parking was still there, and you were trying to cross, over the street, and someone was coming from the left, and you were just completely obscured by that, the parking on the side of the road. So, and they would have no idea you were there until they got literally to the crosswalk. And so what we do with managing sightlines is we bulge out a little bit on the curb where the crossings are, so that cars who are coming from either direction can actually see you when you're moving through. And this is something that we can implement very easily in a lot of streets, and what you'll see happening a lot when streets are redone, especially in areas with a lot of pedestrian activity like downtowns. Even something as simple as adding a pedestrian island can be really important for kids and for older folks, because it gives them kind of a place to stop, rest if they need to reevaluate what's going on, check for traffic, and things like that. And that's that's literally just building a little bit of a median and putting a space for people to stop right there. Leading pedestrian intervals is another great mechanical kind of engineering thing we can do, which is just adjusting our stoplights to ensure that pedestrians can cross the street, kids can cross the street without having to watch for cars getting a green protected left turn, and risk hitting them and not understanding that there are pedestrians crossing the street at that time. It can really only be a couple seconds. All it means is it just gives them time to get out in the street and be visible before people start driving. And then finally, not finally, and then hawk beacons are another great use that you'll see a lot of the time, which are just, they're not quite as intense as stoplights, but they give you kind of a flashing beacon, a flashing idea that there are pedestrians crossing, there are kids crossing here, and that you need to be more cautious. And then finally, just using high visibility materials and making sure that what we're using is, a high quality reflective paint substance, and not just slapping some white paint on the ground that will be gone, in a year and not feel safe. Move on to transit. So transit, this is something that in Georgia is a little bit lacking outside of Atlanta, but in streets where transit is available, and we would certainly love to see transit available in many more places, just as a complete streets approach, and for it's another way for kids to get around independently. But it's about making it safe on the street, providing safe transit stops, allowing the passengers to exit safely, and especially to cross if needed. So this is something again that we see, is that a lot of times you'll see a transit stop, people will get off the bus, and the bus will drive off, and they need to cross the street, and they're in the middle of nowhere. There's no way for them to cross safely. They're still on a big highway or something, or on a big arterial, and there's traffic everywhere. And if they wanted to cross safely, they'd have to walk, 0.75 miles to an intersection and walk all the way back, and it's just not going to happen. So making sure that we site our crossings or our bus stops kind of where it makes sense and where it's safe, and bulbing out our stops, just like you can see here, to kind of make sure that people can just step right on and off the bus safely, without having to interact with traffic. And then finally, just making sure that it's comfortable and safe and feels like an actual thing that they can do, by providing, shelters, benches, nice signage. Simple things like that really are part of the Complete Streets package, because it makes it legitimate and makes it a full service that is shown as being maintained and as safe and efficient. And then and then shade, providing shade, shelter, trees, anything like that just makes it safer and also adds some visual interest to get drivers to slow down and to be a little bit more conscious. Cycling infrastructure, this is the good stuff. So a lot of people are biking now, and this is kind of the new thing, is to talk about cyclists. And there's a reason for that, is that it's really fun and it's a really great way to get around, especially in smaller areas, and especially with the rise of e-bikes. We're seeing a lot more people start to bike not for recreation, but to get around and to kind of cut out car trips that they would otherwise have taken. And this is really important for kids. Kids kind of traditionally are the ones who, when you think of kids riding bikes, it's a very kind of childhood kind of thing. And providing an ability for them to do that is our responsibility as adults and as people who are, designing the built world and managing it. And so including bike infrastructure, which includes bike lanes and trails and greenways and things like that, is really important. And in a complete streets framework, just providing bike lanes and bike infrastructure in general is a huge part of that. In general, what we're talking about is protected bike lanes as the ideal. Protected bike lanes, it could mean a lot of different things. It can mean, raised bollards, medians, posts. It could be a separate path. It can be a conventional bikeway, bikeable shoulder. Shared streets are options. They're not ideal. Even conventional bike lanes are not ideal. But anything that we can add is part of a complete streets approach that will help in this way. So you can see a couple examples here. A raised median is, just some way to physically protect the bike lane, protect the cyclists from traffic. You can do separated lanes just through kind of bollards and little temporary plasticky things, which again is not ideal, but it's definitely an incremental thing we can do at times. A lot of times you'll see the conventional lanes. This is what a lot of complete streets policies will suggest doing, is whenever there's a restriping or a redoing of a road of some sort, they will add a conventional bike lane like this. And then bikeable shoulders, especially for kind of longer routes, maybe out in the country. And then another one is shared streets, which is not very common in the United States, but is common enough in Europe, where pedestrians and cyclists and cars actually all share the same space. But cars are kind of kicked to the bottom of the hierarchy and have to go really slow. And it works very well in Europe, but it hasn't been tested very, very well here in the United States. There've been a couple pilot projects, especially kind of in Florida. Miami has tried a couple experiments, and I don't think they've really invested too heavily in it. So it's still something that they're kicking around, but that would definitely be an option to consider. And then streetscape and lane design. So like I said, a complete streets, a street for kids, is a design problem. And so a lot of times when we talk about this, it does involve making changes to the actual street layout. And we saw that kind of at that first original image. And really what that means a lot of times is doing a traditional road diet, where you're kind of taking a road with too many lanes, more lanes than it needs, and taking one out and reallocating that space elsewhere. Narrowing lanes and adding that space to create bike lanes or parallel parking or speed control elements, readjusting lane widths and adding things like that. You can see even in this image, you can imagine what the street probably looked like before this adjustment. Was probably, a lane in each direction and a big turning lane, maybe 2 lanes in one direction, probably just a lot of pavement, probably a lot of speed, people going really fast. But you can also see it's definitely a downtown, maybe a kind of a medium-sized city downtown. And they didn't have to do any other paving or anything like that. All we did was remove a lane, add some kind of angled parking in the middle, maybe add a bike lane, add some parallel parking, and that's it. That's really all it was, and add some trees, obviously. So we talked about road diets, that same thing, just taking a street like this here. You can see what this one was. Everybody has seen streets like this. It doesn't look very safe, especially it doesn't look very safe, for a group of 7-year-olds or something. But the one on the right looks a little bit better, right? I mean, you can see there's a pedestrian island, it just kind of looks a little bit safer and a little bit more stable. And then kind of an engineering problem is fixing curb extensions and curb radii. So what this means is that when the curbs of a street are really round, it means that people go really fast around them. And this is a really big problem for streets that we're trying to design for kids because, like I said, they are more likely to have trouble at intersections. And when we design our curbs for people to move through them as quickly as possible, we are all but inviting conflict. And it's a pretty easy fix, and it just involves boxing out our curbs and making them just a little bit more like a right angle so that you can't kind of drift around them like a race car driver and you have to stop, kind of pull into the road and make a full turn more slowly. These race car kind of wide turn radius where you don't have to really think about it. You just tilt the wheel a little bit. These really are not good for our streets where we expect kids and pedestrians and people to be walking around. It's just not a safe thing to be doing. And then providing lighting and landscaping, of course, are huge things here. And what that means is, when we design a complete street, it's providing services for everybody, but it's also about making it safe. And one way to make it safe is by lowering speeds in general. And adding lighting both increases safety and lowers speeds because it adds kind of more visual elements. It's the same with landscaping. It's not just a pretty thing. It's not just kind of a pretty thing we can throw up there to make it more pleasant. When you add elements of complexity to a road and add elements of interest, you'll see people slow down. That's why we drive really fast on the highway, because there's nothing there. We just go really, really fast. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing really going on. It's fine. We just go really fast. That's not what we want in a city. It's not what we want in an area where there are going to be a lot of people around. So we want to add elements of interest. We want to add making sure things are lit so we can see those elements of interest, and we can see the pedestrians, and we can see the kids, and we can see people walking around. And then adding trees and landscaping and things like that, because those also add elements of interest. And they also serve some protection roles. They add a little bit of a buffer just naturally to people kind of walking on the sides. All right, so wrapping up here. We know generally now kind of what are the general ingredients of a complete street. So how do we actually start making a plan? And what does it mean to make a plan? Well, there are actual complete streets policies that you can adopt in your city right now. And a lot of cities actually have done so. And there's a couple different ways you can do it. Most of them are ordinances or resolutions. A lot of the ones that I've seen are ordinances. And, basically what these say is, we as a city, every time that we are going to do a new street project or a new road project or whatever kind of project, this ordinance says that we have to consider the complete streets policies. We have to go look at the best practices and see which of them we can implement here. And these can be, some of these can be better than others. Some of them have a whole lot of, this can be waived by, the council, or this requirement can be waived by the engineer or whatever. And they can have those, and that's fine. But the most important thing is you've got to have something like that kind of makes you stop and say, we need to think about this street. How are we going to make it a complete street? How are people going to use it? Are kids going to be using this? Can we make it so that kids can use this? And all kinds of stuff like that. And you can do resolutions, ordinances, all the way up to kind of formal design standards and plans and internal policies and things like that, all the way through, depending on your agency, depending on your city. So the steps to doing that just kind of starts just as a vision for what the city wants its complete streets to look like. Why does a city want complete streets? Why does your agency want complete streets? Why is this important to you? Because it has to be important to you and important to your community. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. There's no real point talking about it if it's not something that people find important. You need to figure out a definition of what it means for a street to be for all users. Does that mean like I said before, are we generally thinking about, millennial yuppie types, or are we really thinking about all users? Are we designing for people with disabilities? Are we designing for people who are trying to age in place, into retirement? Are we designing for, people with strollers and kids? And are we designing for, 9-year-olds on their way to school? Are we designing for 13-year-olds on their way to the gas station to get a Snickers bar? What does this mean? And where will it apply? So is it only applying to new construction? Is it applying to whenever we dig up a road to, fix a water pipe? Do we have to put in a complete streets improvement? What about resurfacing? What about if a new development comes in that is doing a whole new neighborhood? Do they have to look at the complete streets requirements? These are all questions that you've got to figure out. You want to put some goals in, making sure kind of what are your goals? What are your goals for a different neighborhood? What are your goals for the city? Kind of how many interventions do you want to do? What are some goals that you want to see accomplished out of this policy? You can set the guidelines. So the guidelines can be internal, contextual, specific, kind of whatever you decide, or they can just be referenced. There are a lot of design guidelines out there from the Complete Streets Coalition, from AARP, all kinds of places that you can find really detailed design guidelines. I mean, even down to sightline distances and measurements and anything like that. Moving on, you can do performance measures. You want to have some way of being some way of being accountable, some way of saying that we have improved in some manner. We have completed X number of streets. We have improved X number of safe routes to this school. We've completed whatever, something that we have done to show that we didn't just pass this ordinance or pass this policy and then just kind of ignored it. And then once you've developed that, you need to set a timeline. Make sure that we want this policy to be adopted by X day. We want this policy to be in consideration by X time. We want to meet with such and such nonprofit group and make sure we get their support and their advocacy for this, whatever that takes, and then move on from there. And with that, I'll just kind of leave you with some resources. One of the best ones that you can look at are the NACDO Street Design Guides. This is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. They actually have an entire design guide called Streets for Kids, Designing Streets for Kids. It's incredible. It's free. All of these are free in some manner or other. If you just go to the website, there's Kids Street Design Guide, Bike Design Guide, Urban Street Design Guide, Stormwater Design Guide, Transit Design Guide. They're really, really good. Great resource for kind of getting a handle around what this looks like in different types of streets. There's a Complete Streets in the Southeast specifically toolkit. The Complete Streets Coalition has all kinds of stuff, briefings on cost, differences between rural and small town streets, policy development, model ordinances, implementation strategies, everything you might want to move forward on this in reality in your area. And then Safe Routes to School, which has a lot of confluence with this. By designing complete streets, you are designing a lot of times safe routes to school for kids. And it's a really important organization that does a lot of work here too. And that's it. I'm going to turn on the video so you can actually see me. Hello. Well, that's it. I hope that that was at least somewhat enjoyable and useful. If you have any questions, please, we have a little bit of time. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box. I'm not sure if I can unmute you or if you can unmute yourself. But if you do have any questions, please feel free. Either way. Oh boy. Chelsea says, yes, I can send out the slides, and I'll send out a link to the presentation as well once I get it on the YouTube. Yes, GDOT does have an absolutely great design guide, which I think came out fairly recently. But I have looked at that. That's really good for our Georgia folks. GDOT itself has adopted a complete streets policy, which is really progressive for State Department of Transportation. A lot of times for years, state DOTs were, I don't want to say the villains, but they were not very favorably looked upon. And GDOT adopting a complete streets policy was a huge deal and a really, really good, really good sign that GDOT was caring about this and was, very interested and cared about pedestrian and cycling and complete streets issues. Well, great. Well, all right. Well, thank you everybody again. Let me know if you should have my email this morning through this presentation. I'll send out I'll send out the slides and I'll send out anything else that I find. If you have any questions or want any more information, please let me know. And thanks again.